right, welcome to the next episode of Conscious Physician, Medicine and Psychedelics podcast. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Van Warren here with us today. Dr. Warren, tell us about you. We've gotten to know each other in just the past few months since the Psilocybin Medical Act passed. Then we had the launch of the Next Tier Facilitator meetups, and that's how we started to, be in each other's orbits. And I'm so grateful for it. If you would introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, thank you very much. And I want to say, first off, thank you for having me on this podcast. I hope we can share some useful information with your audience, something that they can find some comfort in and actually use in their journey of life. A little bit about myself. Well, I like to think of it this way. I was born at an early age, and I had a lot to learn. I'm 75 years old now, and I still have a lot to learn. Learning is one of my joys in life, and throughout my life, I have turned my educational ventures into areas that I feel will be useful in helping people in the world and help to relieve suffering in the world. When I was 15 years old, I was in Southern Baptist Sunday school, and I'm kind of a recovering Southern Baptist at this point. And I used to be a magician. I was uh, an amateur magician when I was a kid. And so I did this little magic show at church, and my Sunday school teacher came up afterwards and he said, "Hey, how would you like to learn hypnosis?" And turns out he had been a traveling hypnotherapist. And so I said, "Oh, I'd love it." He saw that I was a little off the beaten path, so to speak. And so um, he taught me how to do hypnosis. And I started experimenting with my friends and somehow stumbled onto what I later found was past life regression work. And so we were just having a great time, my friends and I, looking at past lives. And so that brought up a tremendous amount of questions for me. Reincarnation was not a word that I knew at that time very much. But so that led me down a path of curiosity about life and spirit and where we came from, where we're going. And eventually it led me to the big question of where am I right now, which is probably a lot more important than where I came from and where I'm going. Started doing meditation. Then I found drugs back in the 60s. LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and a few other things. And the experiences that I had were completely mind-blowing for a little Southern Baptist boy from Abilene, Texas. But I recognized that there was something there that I could see and feel when I was taking these substances, and I couldn't grab it again when I came down. And so I kept taking it. Eventually, I realized that my journey in life was about learning how to stay in those states that I was experiencing and stay there without the drugs. Eventually, I started practicing yoga, went into an ashram, lived in an ashram for several years, studying, teaching yoga, meditation, and things like that. And the next phase of my journey was to become a doctor of Oriental medicine and see how I could help others. During my practice years as a doctor, a lot of my patients needed end-of-life care. And I was a little bit lost. So eventually I started studying end-of-life care with different spiritual traditions and Buddhist and Taoist specifically, with some sprinkles of Christianity thrown in there and anything else that I could find. And my wife at the time became quite ill, and I knew that she was dying. We all knew that. And so I wanted to help her as best I could in all ways. But acupuncture was what I thought a little too harsh for her end of life journey because it would bring her back too much into her body. And no matter what I did, and there are a lot of spiritual points and things like that to assist people in acupuncture, but no matter what I did, it just seemed a little harsh. So I explored essential oils and I found some really incredible resources that matched up my learning about Chinese medicine, the five elements, and things like that, and how the oils fit into all of that framework. And so I concocted a bunch of formulas, essential oil formulas, to help her through the dying process. And after she passed away, I continued that interest, and so then I became a death doula eventually, and created more essential oils. Wrote a couple of books on different subjects relating to all of this. And now I use essential oils and meditation processes and things like that to assist people in their conscious living and conscious dying journey of life. And I think I've taken up enough time on that subject.
That was fantastic. Thank you for taking us through that journey. And I can only imagine how challenging it must have been going through that with her and how rewarding at the same time to be able to help her, support her in an innovative way, because that's something that in medicine once in a while we'll talk about, like the extent of it is lavender, having a diffuser in the room with some lavender um in the hospital setting is really the only thing that I've heard of, which I'm just like, yes, if it's helping the patient, if it's something that's aligned with the patient and the family wants to do it, absolutely. Now, how did you just go by the process of experimentation to figure out what it was that worked with her? I'm just curious, this learning experimentation process and then being able to do it repeatedly with others. I'm assuming you're under the role of death doula, that you have been doing deeper work with this over the years. Is that right?
Yes. Um, The the first part of it was to research how the oils fit into the five element system, which it was a system I was very comfortable with in terms of Chinese medicine. In the Taoist tradition, there's very specific ways that the soul, spirit, what they call the Shen, Shen, how the Shen enters into the physical body at the moment of conception. And then there are very specific processes that happen, how the soul embeds itself into the body and then moves out into the world, both to bring the destiny forth of our own individual soul, bring that out into the world, and to enjoy the world and report back to heaven what's going on this planet, so to speak.
May I interrupt you? Because
Please.
will you tell us about the five elements first? And then I
Yes.
have other questions.
Okay. Yes. The way this came about, humans have always wanted to know what's going on. We want to make sense of our environment and our life, always have. And so the ancient Chinese Taoist people looked around and they said, look, there are all these elements that make up this known world. There's air and there's fire and there's water and there's earth and wood. And so they said, how are we as humans interacting with all of these elements in the universe? And are these elements actually part of us? And so they began to categorize how these elements on the external world are actually reflected from within our own spirit. And so this categorization came about, and everything in the known universe they were able to fit into these five elements. So the water element, there's psycho, emotional, physical, and spiritual qualities associated with the water element. uh, certain yin yang principles, the opposites of, say, fear and courage within the water element. And then when those are balanced, wisdom arises, which is one of the higher properties of the water element. The wood element, when it's balanced, benevolence arises. Wood represents growth, the natural growth of spring, etc. Then the fire element, when it's balanced, we have appropriate response, propriety. What is the appropriate response to this very moment and what's happening within us? And of course, there are organ systems associated with that, psycho-emotional, physical, both problems such as health problems as well as solutions, etc. Then the earth element, when it's balanced, the highest integrity, faith, and compassion arise. And that again has all of these other qualities of physical, emotional, psychic, etc. The last element of the five is the mental element, which is the minerals of the earth, the minerals in our bones, the minerals that we need as human beings to keep our body healthy, etc. And there are mental and emotional, again, aspects of this. And the highest virtue, when that metal element is balanced, is justice. Justice of that everything will find its balance in life. Everything will come out and be balanced. So then it moves back into the water element. So these are stages of our life: infancy and childhood, adulthood, adolescence, and old age. And so everything fits in here, and the plants, grains, food, animals, everything fits into this model. And it's all about relationship. How do all of these elements create a harmonious relationship known as life? And so when something is out of balance, Chinese medicine attempts to correct it by strengthening something that is too weak, one of the elements, or draining off a little bit of something that's too much if there's an excess. For instance, fever, that's an excess. So we want to bring the fever down so that it doesn't disrupt the system anymore. So we have ways with acupuncture and herbs, essential oils, diet, exercise, meditation, etc., to help correct all the imbalances. I think that's enough on the five elements, unless you have other questions.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. And then you mentioned the soul entering the body in a particular way at conception and leaving the body in or being in relationship with life and the divine. And we didn't get to what happens at death, at least the physical form, but I'm very curious about that movement of, like, is there a particular polarity in which it is believed that the soul enters the physical form and leaves the physical form? I'm very curious.
Yes, in a very shorthand version here, at the moment of conception, heaven, Tao, they call it heaven, they call it the Tao, the source, which we really can't describe, but yet we know is present because we can experience it as peace, love, harmony, joy, and all of the wonderful virtues that are available as humans. Heaven sends a spirit and it joins with the physical of the sperm and the egg. So when the spirit joins with the physical, we now have a new form of life on this planet known as a human being. And the spirit then moves into the forming embryo and begins to um, center itself in what the Chinese call the Dantian, the lower Dantian. That's an area of where we store our potential in life. It's where we store our energy in life. It's sort of the batteries of the body. And Once that spirit has established residence in that lower dantian, it's behind the navel between the kidneys. The spirit then rises up through a very specific acupuncture channel, one of the 8, what they call extraordinary channels. Most people know of the 12 main channels, the heart channel, the stomach channel, etc. Well, these extraordinary channels are much deeper, and they're the ones that form first. Well, the first one to form is one that goes directly from the dantian up to the heart, the spirit moves up to the heart, where it centers itself in what the Chinese call the palace of the heart. And from there, communication, both with heaven, back through the kidneys, back through the dantian, back to heaven, and to the outside world is established. In the book, the Tao Te Ching, which is an ancient book of philosophy, it is said that when one looks inward, they will see heaven. When they look outward, they will see the world. Well, that's the role of spirit sitting in the heart. And then the heart, that spirit, the Shen, begins to send sparks into all of the other areas of the body where these other elements are beginning to form and the acupuncture channels are beginning to grow into. And so that's where the 5 elements begin to form, and communication with all parts of the system are brought online. Now, there's a whole lot more to it, but could go on for days. I mean, literally, this stuff's been going on for thousands of years, so much could be said. At the time of death, the process is reversed. The spirit in the heart moves back down that central channel, and it comes back into the lower dantian, and then it exits out through the dantian and moves back to heaven, where whatever happens next happens.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for making it palatable and easy to understand. That by itself is a whole wisdom of teaching. It's not that easy. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. And so, sorry, I interrupted that portion of the story that you were talking about and how you came about utilizing and experimenting with aromatherapy and essential oils.
Well, so I had the background in Chinese medicine, and when I started fitting the oils into these 5 element categories, and then figuring out with a lot of help, it wasn't just me figuring it out, some very potent books and sources that I had run into, figured out how to balance these elements with the oils. Some of the essential oils are used to turn up the dial, so to speak, rev up the energy. Some are meant to bring down the energy. Some are meant to move the energy through the entire system. And so I formulated different blends that would do very specific things with each of these 5 elements and the acupuncture meridians that are associated with the elements, because each one of the elements has a couple of acupuncture channels that they open out into so that they can participate in the world and bring energy from the world in and bring the spirit out into the world. And so, as my wife at the time was going through her processes, she had pain, she had doubt, she had fear. Well, all of these are under the purview of the different 5 element systems. And so, by formulating oils to bring about a state of balance within each one of these elements, and then coming up with a process, sort of a massage process, where I would use my hands with the oil on my hands to move the energy down her arms and legs through these acupuncture channels. So I matched up the oils to the channels, to the 5 elements, and would give her this massage. It wasn't like a massage where I was trying to massage the muscles. It was simply an application of the oil using my hands, my heart, and spirit to bring about a state of balance for her. And it did. It reduced her fear. It reduced her pain. It helped her move through this dying process the last year of her life with much more grace and much more humor and much more acceptance. And so then I started teaching this to other doctors of Oriental medicine, massage therapists, anybody that wanted to come to my seminars. And that's when COVID hit. Well, she passed away a few years before COVID, but when COVID hit, I quit doing teaching and turned to things that were much closer to home. And I have been pursuing a lot of artwork since then.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah, and one thing that comes up for me is I would, if this is something that is feels good to you, we have a hospice program at practice in town in Albuquerque, ABQ Hospice and Palliative, and know that our staff would really enjoy learning from you if you decided that you wanted to teach the staff how they can do this with patients when they're transitioning or otherwise, or they can teach their family. We're not a usual just hospice program, of course. Can't just be that. You've been there, done that for a decade, and it's like, nah, it's not enough. And so we do have all kinds of medications that we also use, but the ability to offer a patient or family members other ways to help with any symptom. It may be anxiety, it may be pain, it may be agitation, which can come from many different things at the end of life. And a lot of it has to do with the energetic connection that patients have with their family members and where their family members are at. And so
Yes.
I actually sit with our patients and family members, and we do breathing exercises. We go through forgiveness exercises, and that changes the dynamic tremendously to where the patient who is transitioning has an easier transition, or even holding the body instead of laying on top of the body. So it's beautiful that you have created this path truly of bringing ease and alleviating suffering in this population in our community. And we're all going to die. Everybody's going to go through it. And how are we going to go through it? And do we have different modalities to offer to patients and families? And so that would be a really awesome thing if that's something that feels in alignment to you to, come and educate our staff or just do a couple of lectures with them and we can all learn from you.
Love to. And I took it a step further than these five element oils. Using the background of the five elements, I put together a series of four specific blends for death doulas, for end of life care. And they are not just for the client, the patient, the one who's dying. They're also for the family. Because, as you pointed out, dying is something that we may be doing alone in one sense, but nothing in this world is done without relationship to everyone and everything else. And so when the family is relaxed or at least coping comfortably, hopefully, it certainly makes it easier for the patient. Now, they're going to die, as you pointed out, everybody's going to die, and they're going to die sooner or later anyway. The question is, can it be conscious and can it have joy in the process? And yes, grief is a very tough thing for any of us to deal with. Um, and so I included that in one of my oil blends. Those four for the doulas, there's one that I call Delight, and it is to simply give us a hit of joy. It has a lot of orange, essential oil in it. If anybody wants a little hit of happiness, take a big snootful of, not in your nose, of course, but smell orange. Orange is a very, very uplifting essential oil by itself. So the blend Delight has a bunch of things in it that lifts the spirit and brings joy. There's an oil that I use, in fact, that is the one I gave you last time we saw each other, the spirit oil. That one helps to balance the spiritual part of the five elements that we talked about. It helps to bring a person up to those higher, what's Chinese called the higher virtues of wisdom and benevolence and faith and compassion and being able to have appropriate response to this very moment. Those are the things that oil does. It lifts the spirit. It lifts us to awareness of our spirit. It doesn't lift the spirit. The spirit never needs to be lifted. It just is. What happens is we forget that spirit is constantly the ground upon which we walk and the air that we breathe and everything that's overhead. It's all spirit. So spirit helps bring us back to that realization. And then there is a blend called transitions, which helps us let go. It helps us be okay with moving into the next moment, whatever that is. Family members can use this a lot as well. And then there's a blend that I call grief relief, which helps us come to terms with our grief, process our grief. One of the things about the metal element in Chinese medicine is it teaches us what to hold on to and what to let go of. So it teaches us to hold on to the experience, but let go of the pain and let go of the trauma associated with this experience, because there's always wisdom in any experience. But it's not a rush to do this. We all have to do it in our own time. But that's the underlying concept that I put this into this oil blend for grief relief. There is a fifth, which is called emergency. And it will snap somebody. In the old movies, somebody would be freaking out and they'd slap them across the face. Well, that's kind of what emergency does, but it's not quite that harsh. But it brings us right back into this moment and helps us have a different perspective on what's happening right now. So it drops anxiety, it drops the freak out that people have when they're thinking about losing a loved one. So those are completely different than the five element oils, although they are based on five element theory as well. I just use them in a different way and made them specifically for death doulas, for end of life care.
And do you exclusively now practice death doula end of life care?
Well, um, I I can't say exclusively. I do not have an office where I practice acupuncture anymore. I do have clients that are dying and I work with them. I use the oils, I use acupuncture, I use whatever tools I have, counseling, meditation, breathing exercises, a lot of the same things that you are very familiar with. I employ those tools as well. So that's pretty much what I do other than stay in my art studio.
That's lovely. That's lovely. And Van, while we're in this space, because, the Psilocybin Medical Act just went through and there's a lot of excitement around it and all of that. And one of the diagnoses that we have in the bill is end of life anxiety. And so, from your experience, with psychedelics in general, what have you seen? We know the research, right? We know the research. Some of us have had some experiences with it and whatnot. But I'm curious to hear, what is your perspective about it?
Well, I've been trained in psilocybin assisted therapy, and um, it wasn't specifically for end of life care. It was more for the therapeutic model, working through trauma, etc. And at the end of life, we may or may not face our trauma. We may not have time to work through our trauma. But the good news is pretty soon, none of that matters. When people are really clear, that they're dying, all kind of things can happen. And a lot of things just simply fall away as far as the importance of dealing with different kinds of trauma, specific traumas. But what we're left with is the residue of a lifetime of suffering and joy too, if we can put our focus there. But in the beginning of the dying process, when we first find out, nobody wants to die, or rarely do they want to die. They have guilt, they have anxiety, they have fear, all of the normal things. It's pretty much like the same process that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross explained on the grieving process. You know, there may be anger, there may be denial. All of those things we go through when we find out we're going to die. And depending on how much hard work we've done in our life, we may come to terms and grips with all of that a little easier than others. A few years ago, just a little quick aside, I went to a new doctor. She drew my blood. She said, okay, we're going to do this and do that. She called me back in a couple of weeks later and she said, I'm sending you to uh, a hematologist over at the oncology department. She said, looking at your blood, I think you might have leukemia. Well, my first thought was, oh God, I don't want to die. After sitting with that for a little while, I had to laugh at myself because I have spent years preparing to die. That's what conscious living to me is about. It's being ready for whatever happens, whether it be another day of living or another day of dying. The whole Buddhist thing is that everything dies, and there is impermanence is just a fact of the universe. Well, later I got to looking at that fear again, and I realized that on a spiritual level, maybe I was not as accepting as I hoped I would be when I got the news. But the organism itself is a whole different animal, and it does not want to die. Even single cell organisms will move away from any stimulus that's threatening. So it took me a few years to, and I still process that reaction that I had. And so the the psilocybin specifically at end of life, what I have seen that it's capable of is giving a completely broadened perspective on what life is. In our ego state, we are, and the ego is not a bad thing. It's what makes us who we are in a sense, or who we think we are. The ego is there to make sense of the experiences of our life and who we think we are and what our capabilities are and all those kinds of things. Well, the problem with the ego is that it believes that the world is centered, that we are the center of the universe. Everything is happening in relation to me. And when we take some of these entheogens, which is another word for the psychedelics, we get a much broader perspective, and we see that, wait a minute, I'm part of the whole. I'm not the center of the universe. I'm part of the universe, and I can bring incredible joy into my life, and I can share it with others. I can um, it's not so personal what's happening to me. And that is, to me, the most profound thing that psychedelics can do for a person. Once it's not so personal, and I have this much broader perspective, I'm much more able to handle my fear, my anxiety, etc., because it's not personal. I'm a part of all of it, part of the whole. And so that's the perspective that I have found that psychedelics at end of life can bring to a person who takes them.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And that brings me to The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And one of the agreements is don't take it personal. And I think, as you said, in general, entheogens do that regardless of when you take them. That's maybe one of the reasons the traumas that we might have perceived that trauma at the time because we didn't have the resourcefulness to deal with them or the support to deal with them at the moment is what you just shared. It's so interesting. You know, one of the things that I see in my patient population is that it's too late to even offer an entheogen or a psychedelic to someone by the time they get their hospice referral. And so I do see more benefit, to be honest with you, in that population where I'm just like, they're way too close to transition time. And most people don't want to even talk about it. It's just too, they're going through too much in this moment. I do see the potential for healing for the family members, though, for those patients who are far into their process. But there have been people who are in the palliative realm, in that continuum where they may have a year or two, and there's more of a conversation that can be had to see where they're at and to introduce entheogens into their processing of this news that they got that they might have a terminal diagnosis. And your reaction or response to that news is so beautiful and so human and so conscious. I love that. It's so true. You live a conscious life, so you're ready for all of it.
Well, it's nice to have that slap in the face as to how human we are, as well as how much spirit we are at the same time. When you said about it almost being too late, I'm not sure exactly what your timeline is that you're referring to. However, you did mention 1 year, etc. And I think for me, if it even coming up on the 6 month mark, if that's something that the client wants, and maybe even closer, but there has to be a pretty deep rapport to bring that forward. And that is one of the major differences that I see between being the medical doctor in hospice versus a death doula. I have done a lot of work over the years as a chaplain and an interfaith chaplain. So I really look for any opening, however small it might be, to get into the deep weeds of who we are as spirit with a person. That's one reason I don't hang around people too much. It's because I'm afraid it'll become annoying if that's pretty much all I want to talk about.
Not in my realm.
No, I realize that not in your realm. And I have been very fortunate over the years to surround myself with people that I can talk about this kind of stuff with. And in fact, the two clients that I currently have are friends of mine that I've had as friends for over 40 years. And so we have been down so many roads together. And so when I do take on a new client or talk to somebody about what end of life care, what a doula does, I'm really looking for that opening. And not to promote anything, but to explore everything. I've never actually suggested that the family members use the entheogens for their grief process, etc., and acceptance. I've never gone there with that. Mine is now I do a lot of grief work with the families afterwards, but I try to do that same grief work during the process. I'm not going to say let's get it over with, but let's explore it while we can still turn to the person and say, and by the way, I love you so much, instead of wishing we'd said it while we're sitting there in grief. And that being a death doula has a different dimension than a lot of hospice. I'm sure not your hospice because I know your heart. And that's reflected in everything that you do. I know that about you. But most hospice, these are not subjects they really want to talk about, they'll say, well, if you need to talk to the chaplain, then because most hospice is about palliative care, taking care of the diminished capacities of the body as it begins to fade away. I understand that. My concern is paying attention to what endures, what goes on past death. Um, and if a person wants to, and I normally want to, we can get into that conversation real deep, real quick without it freaking people out. And if psychedelics might help with that, I'm totally on board.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. The whole world of death doula, I came to recognize it in the past year and a half or so. And I find it so wholesome and so important for people to have this being who's chosen to be with the whole system, that family system, and the patient every step of the way. And there's nothing more wholesome that we can provide. In fact, our volunteer coordinator is a death doula, and we have a Reiki 3 as a volunteer as well. We work with death doulas in the community all the time. I think it's so important to recognize where my expertise ends and someone else's begins, because it truly is a community effort when it comes to birth and death and everything in between. But we forget when we're in between, when we're my age, when we're in the middle ages, we forget that we really need each other's support all the time. And especially in those transition times in life. I have so much gratitude, and I'm so inspired by the work you do, Van. Thank you for what you do. And I'm just so excited that you're in our community and we're connected here.
Thank you. And I have to say, I get a lot out of it. If it was at times, certainly it's hard, but the reward of what I learn about myself and seeing the love that is being shared. And yeah, occasionally having to put out some forest fires when family members are having but it's a beautiful experiment in life to do this kind of work. The first training that I had was not called being a death doula. It was about conscious living and conscious dying. And it came from a group of people that put together the first hospice here in America that was specifically and strictly for spiritual conscious awareness at time of death. And it was put together by a man named Ram Dass, which I'm sure most people have heard of.
Know that. Wow.
Yes, Ram Dass, a guy named Dale Borglum, and Stephen Levine. And these three men, through the Seva Foundation, which was Ram Dass's foundation up in Taos, started this hospice in Santa Fe in 1983. Well, and it was totally based on the spiritual principles that they had learned and the psychedelic principles, the wisdom that had come from that in their own lives. And now Ram Dass has passed on, and Stephen Levine has passed on, and Dale Borglum is still running that organization. It's called Living, Dying, or something like that. And he's on Ram Dass Radio weekly. He teaches. He's in his early 80s, and he spent time in India with Ram Dass at the ashram where his guru, his teacher, was Maharaji. How I got introduced to the spirituality of end of life care, and now that organization is out in California, Marin County, and it's wonderful. So it's a wonderful model that I had to plug in the things that I knew about and the things that were near and dear to my heart. I felt like putting my hand in a nice warm glove when I found that concept of that process. So sometimes people ask me what I do, and I say, well, I'm a facilitator for conscious living and conscious dying, because it's so much more than just the dying process. You know, being conscious is the key to it all. That's what we're here for. That's what our destiny is to wake up and be aware, aware of love, aware of relationship, aware of connectedness, et cetera. And any tool that I have that I've learned over the years, and possibly past lifetimes, who knows, any tool is fair game for that.
I love it. And on that note, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your warmth, your conscious presence with us today. It's truly a privilege and honor to have you here with us. And how can people find you if they align with?
Well, I have an outdated website. There's very little on there. I do talk about conscious living and dying. I do talk about the oils for death doulas, and that is drvanwarren.com. Pretty easy to find, drvanwarren.com. And there's a link there that will find its way to one of my uh, emails. And so if anybody has any comments, any questions, anything you would like to discuss, in between working out there in my workshop and loving my friends, I'll be happy to answer whatever I can.
Thank you so much, Van.